horror is enjoying what you might call a recrudescence. One of the hits of the London Film Festival recently was David Cronenberg's film The Fly, a gory update of a harmlessly tacky Vincent Price vehicle of 1958. There's a new wave of horror writers in Britain, notably Clive Barker and Ian Banks. The guru of the movement, some say, is Ramsey Campbell, Merseyside's answer to Stephen King. And in America, the long-despised comic book has been taken to new heights, or are they depths, of visual sophistication by Alan Moore, a Northampton man famous for his Watchmen series. As you might expect, these are all mild-mannered chaps and model citizens. So why do they dabble in nightmares and gore? We sent horror enthusiast Charles Shaar Murray to find out.
There are dark places in our land where mortal man cannot hope to enter, except at the risk of his very soul. I have trod this shadowy path to a suburban house near Liverpool. Within these walls dwells the entity they call Ramsey Campbell, from whose fevered mind sprang obsession, incarnate, dark companions, and the height of the scream. Campbell holds the secret I must risk my sanity to learn. Why is it that horror is so attractive to serious writers today?
Because it's very much like the way we live today, I would have thought, in a state of kind of muted panic, never quite knowing what is controlling us or what precisely other people around us may think, realising now that, you know, the most ordinary suburban residents may cloak the most hideous atrocities without the neighbours noticing, or if they do notice, maybe saying, well, it's nothing to do with us. A sense that our country is somehow lost in the midst of some terrible seething chaos that at any moment is going to affect us. Again, it seems to me, you know, it's just about people's everyday experience. In addition, you know, religion has gone, so we're all face to face with the abyss. Maybe there really isn't anything else except something very much more terrible than we were brought up to believe. I would have thought horror fiction is expressing really, you know, everyday life.
Do you feel that the horror movie is developing as well and as powerfully as prose horror fiction?
It's certainly got many of the same concerns. I mean, the last 20 years have seen, from maybe Psycho onwards, going back even a little bit further, the kind of horror fiction which is consciously concerned with theme as well as effect. I mean, while on the one hand the new horror film at its worst, or even occasionally at its most spectacular, has turned into a kind of rarey show of expensive special effects, there are the directors who will use effects like this with some intelligence. George Romero, on the one hand, has clearly got enough wit to use his splatter effect sparingly. Somebody like David Cronenberg, who seems to me to be in the business of taking horror almost beyond the point at which one can watch it. Unlike most of those who do that simply in order to give the audience a rite of passage, to say, you know, look, we mustn't look away, I can watch this, so can you. Cronenberg actually seems to be showing you what you thought you couldn't look at, or what you were afraid to see, and challenging you to do something with that perception.
In a way, I don't find those things disgusting, you see. I mean, this is something that other people find disgusting. Well, let me put it this way. I'm challenging my audience's sense of aesthetics as well as my own. And even in The Fly, I've found that people will readily admit that after they've gotten used to the character who's changed into quite a monstrous creature, by the end of the film, they're kind of used to him, and maybe even fond of the way he looks, you know. And so there's been a change in their response to him aesthetically, and it's because there's some mysteries involved there. I mean, in a sense, that is one of the subjects of my films. It's always struck me as strange that if we were to cut ourselves open and look inside, most of us would be very disgusted at what we saw, but it's us. I mean, it is what we are. It's the substance of what we are, and we carry it around with us all the time. It's the essence of our physical life, and yet we find it repulsive. I find that very strange.
The heyday of the horror comic was the 1950s, when the EC Company terrorized America with titles like Tales from the Crypt and Vault of Horror. However, EC was throttled by the rigid censorship imposed with the introduction of the Comics Code. Now, one title has reversed this tide. DC Comics' Swamp Thing hits the stands each month without the code's filtering influence, and its author has become the most famous and admired comic book writer since Marvel Comics' Stan Lee. Both with the power of his visual imagination and the unparalleled flexibility and articulacy of his prose, He has redefined what is possible and what is permissible in a field once regarded as strictly for children. Horror is an undercurrent in all his work, from the political superhero fable Watchmen to the future war SF of Halo Jones. Surprisingly, he is neither from Nebraska nor New Jersey, but from Northampton. His name is Alan Moore.
Horror is a very potent social tool. I mean, people tend to have sensibilities that have been jaded by the constant exposure to the media, the news headlines, the sort of stuff on television. People tend to build up a sort of an armour around themselves almost, where they don't really have to experience anything terribly closely. Now, horror is such an excellent cutting tool because it can just slice through all of that sort of accumulated dross and sort of sense of deadened emotions, if you like, and actually shock the reader. And having opened them up, having tenderised them with the shock, is able to get across a very powerful message. I mean, I think the other reason why sort of horror is an excellent vehicle in the 1980s is because social conditions have brought the real world much closer to the world that me and other horror writers have been writing about for years. I mean, if you look at, say, things like, something like Alan Bleasdale's Boys from the Black Stuff, Yoss's story, which on one level is a very realistic piece of sort of drama about Liverpool. But on the other hand, I mean, with a very slight change of emphasis, it could easily have been written by Ramsey Campbell, for example. I mean, the idea of somebody going quietly mad in Liverpool with the social security sort of safety nets being wrenched out from underneath them one by one. I mean, that is very much Ramsey Campbell territory.
Whereas there was a kind of horror fiction for a while that would use the contemporary setting as a contrast. It would be the supernatural taking place against a background that was instantly recognisable and banal and everyday and so forth. In my stories, it's much more likely to be an expression of that environment in some way. I can't pretend that this is wholly original. Fritz Leiber was writing stories about Chicago in the 40s, which were probably the greatest single influence on what I write of that kind of story. On the other hand, maybe I've done it in a different way.
What attracted you to horror in the first place?
That it frightened me. Has to be that. Which was to say it did the same thing to me at the age of 7 or 8 as Victorian goblin stories had done to me at the age of 5 or 6. What I also assume it must have done was to present terrors which were in some way controllable. I could read about them and they would go away, though it's only fair to say they went away maybe after a while, maybe after a week of sleepless nights. I mean, when you ask me that question, in a sense, I actually don't know. I mean, my entire childhood was spent in such a kind of state of panic anyway that it astonishes me that I could read stories which did it to me all over again in a different way. I can only assume that the real appeal of them was that they spoke to something larger than themselves. They actually carried a sense of awesomeness as well as a sense of simple terror, and that's presumably what I was looking for, something bigger than myself that I could latch on to.
One incident from my childhood that I can remember very clearly was just having a terror of injury to the eye. And I remember once getting a needle and picking it up and I was about 6 or 7, and just holding it so that the point was just touching my eyelid, and then taking it down and shuddering for about the next 3 weeks. I don't know why I did it was probably completely aberrant behaviour, but it was just, this was the thing that I was most frightened of, and I just had to see what it felt like to know. And yeah, I mean, it made me wince thinking back, I mean, all these years, I think if only I'd slipped or something like that, you know, but that's horror. It's bringing you up to the brink in some way, in a controlled way, but it's making you look at the things that you would otherwise never dream of looking at, the things that you tend to shy away from. And it's a healthy thing, I believe, you know, to actually put yourself through this process, to actually come to terms with what you're scared of, because then it's somehow not quite so big.
Did working in an abattoir in your late teens make an impression on you?
It may have made a slight impression. It wasn't actually an abattoir. We got on the stage after the abattoir. It was still pretty messy. We had a sort of sheepskins with various bodily parts hanging off, you know, and I mean, at the age of 17, I mean, you're quite impressionable, you know, and to be sort of placed in this sort of environment, it does give you a certain appreciation of the more grim sides of reality, shall we say. You know, then I moved on from that to toilet cleaner, and from toilet cleaner to sort of comic book writer. It's been a sort of a steady downhill progression, really, you know. But, yeah, I mean, just living in Northampton. I mean, Northampton's by no means the worst town of its place in the country or the world, but At the same time, we do tend to get an awful lot of very strange crimes in Northampton. It is a very violent town considering its size. In fact, I was living for a good time. I mean, one of the local papers had the idea of drawing a circle with a compass upon a map of the town that happened to include most of the recent murders. And as it happened, if the point of that compass would have been resting upon my writing desk, so if they'd ever triangulated it, I'd have been in deep trouble, you know. But yeah, I mean, Northampton is a place where there is a lot of, behind the lace curtains, there's a lot of madness going on. There's a lot of very evil, nasty, twisted, perverse crime. And it's a good working environment for a horror writer. I mean, it certainly beats the hell out of California. I think that probably if I was sitting by the pool all day, then I might lose some of my edge. But in Northampton, in this sort of dog excrement-littered wasteland, you know, where sort of violent psychopaths lurk upon every corner, it's a perfect ambience, really, you know.
Northampton, I'm deeply sorry. Please write to him, not us.